It is 1 o'clock, so I think we're going to go ahead and get started. Thanks for coming to this session. We're looking forward to a lively and exciting discussion. So let me start quickly with the housekeeping items that you have now heard probably 20 times over the last 2 days, but that I am duty-bound to repeat. First of all, please silence your devices, and please be aware that this session is being recorded. With that in mind, when you ask a question or make a comment, please do come up to the mic. You may believe that you can make yourself heard in this room without the mic, and you may actually technically be right, but it's harder to make yourself heard by the people who will be watching the recording later if you're not at the mic. And when you do make a comment, if you're comfortable doing so, please state your name and your affiliation. That'll just help give everybody some context. We want this discussion to be not only lively, but also respectful. So we hope that everyone will help us out in that regard. So today we're going to be discussing a tantalizing and possibly even a little bit controversial question. And the question is, what if the scholarly communication ecosystem as we currently know it were to disappear overnight and we had to start again from scratch? What would we build in its place? If something like this were to happen, obviously it would give us an unparalleled opportunity to ask ourselves some really fundamental questions. But I think even more importantly than the opportunity to ask those questions is the fact that we would be forced to actually come up with answers. We wouldn't be able to just go, well, that'd be interesting or that'd be interesting. We would have to do something, and the urgent question would be, what will that something look like? The questions that we would be forced to ask ourselves include, what are the things that we do now, not because they fundamentally make sense, but because they made sense 100 or 200 years ago, and we're continuing to do them mainly because of inertia? Or another one, a related question, though not the same one, is what things have we been doing for the past 20 years because existing systems make them necessary, not because those things are actually optimal or even significantly valuable? A third question would be, why do we do scholarly communication? What problem or problems are we trying to solve when we engage in scholarly communication activities? So our panelists today have been giving this issue some serious thought and have brought their ideas with them to feed what we hope will be a lively and exciting conversation with all of you. So let me quickly tell you about our panelists, and then I'll turn the time over to them. So first we're going to hear from Reeta Sinha. She's worked in academic libraries and in the library industry for more than 30 years. Her academic positions include resource management librarian at Lane Medical Library, Stanford University, head of collection development at the UNLV libraries, head of collection management at the Emory University Health Sciences Center Library, and director of serials at the Texas Medical Center Library in Houston. Reeta has also worked for YBP Library Services and has been an active member of professional organizations such as ALA and NASIG. Reeta has a bachelor's degree in geography from the University of Minnesota, a master's in public health from the UT Health Sciences Center Houston, and an MS in library science from the University of North Texas. Next, we're going to hear from Sara Rouhi. She is the Director of Strategic Partnerships at PLOS. She previously managed business development at Digital Science for both Altmetric and Dimensions, as well as author and library outreach at ACS Publications. She co-founded the International Society of Medical Publications Planning's Altmetrics Workshop. Sorry, so many apostrophes. Working group, and was the recipient of SSP's Emerging Leader Award in 2015. Sara writes and speaks frequently on metrics, open access, and diversity in scholarly communication. We'll then hear from Oliver Gadsby. He's president of Rowman and Littlefield's academic and professional publishing businesses in the US and in London. He's worked for 30 years in educational and academic publishing, having started his career as an editor in Germany. He worked for 9 years with Wolters Kluwer, following which he joined Taylor and Francis and became director of strategy and acquisitions for their parent group, Informa. Oliver was CEO of Continuum from 2007 to 2011, after which he joined Rowman and Littlefield and set up the London company from scratch. And then our final speaker will be Courtney Young. She is university librarian at Colgate University. She's previously worked at Penn State's Greater Allegheny, Beaver, and University Park campuses, at Michigan State University and The Ohio State University. She served in a variety of leadership roles in the American Library Association, including being elected the 2014-2015 ALA president. In 2011, Courtney was named a Library Journal mover and shaker, and she frequently presents and publishes on issues related to advocacy, academic librarianship, diversity, leadership, and professional development. And I apologize, I just realized I didn't identify myself. My name is Rick Anderson. I'm a librarian at the University of Utah. Okay, so what we're going to do is each of our panelists will present for 10 minutes, and then after each of their individual presentations, we'll open the floor up to just one quick question if anybody has a burning question that they want to get addressed immediately. After we've had each presentation and follow-up question, if any, when everybody is gone, then we'll open up the discussion to everybody in the room and have a more freewheeling conversation. So with that, I'll turn the time over to Reeta.
Whoa, okay. Can everybody hear me in the back? I'm getting an echo. Is it all right in the back? All right, so thank you all for coming, and thank you, Rick. When Rick approached me about this panel some months back and I read the title, I was really excited. How often do we in our profession get a chance to start anything from scratch? Even as I was in the mulling it over phase and chatting up librarians and colleagues, I was still intrigued. When I sat down to actually put my thoughts on the screen, I thought, wow, this is really hard. I'm not a very good futurist, or in this case, I'm not really good at wiping the slate clean and starting over. The here and now consumes me most days. So after a few false starts, picture the digital equivalent of crumpled sheets of paper being thrown in the recycle bin, I decided to go back to the very beginning, some 300 years ago. I think I have about 9 minutes left. So why journals? Well, for researchers to share, to communicate their findings, what they've discovered, but also to show that they were first, that their research and results were unique, their discoveries made or had the potential to make an impact on their field of study. And through these published works, the journal articles, researchers and scholars were evaluated, they gained recognition, they were rewarded or not, and their scholarly research was preserved. This all remains true today. For the most part, the elements of the publishing ecosystem remain the same. There are content creators, authors, there are content curators, editors, reviewers, there are content providers, publishers of all sorts, and platform providers, and then content consumers. Readers and in an academic environment via the library. So what happened? Well, not in any particular order. For one thing, scholarly publishing, the article and the journal in which it has been published, have become part and parcel of not just the researcher's reputation, but they're also linked to her institution's prestige and the ability to secure funding for future research. Authors and or their department chairs needed articles cited early and often and in top-ranked journals. That may not be the only reason scholars publish where they do, but it is undeniably a consideration. Also, the number of researchers and funding for research grew rapidly from the 1950s, as did the number of articles and journals. Was it too much, too fast, necessary, unnecessary? I don't know. A lot has been going on in all disciplines in the past 70 or 80 years, and it doesn't show any signs of stopping now. Then there was the serials pricing crisis, the double whammy of library budget cuts and increasing annual subscription prices. This is where many of us came in. My first serials cancellation projects were in 1986 and 87 when I was a collection and development assistant in a medical library. Combined, there was the weak dollar, the eye-popping double-digit price increases, and then budget cuts. Despite position titles that include the phrase collection development, I seem to have spent most of my career in libraries doing the opposite, many canceled subscriptions. Then along came online journals. With digital publishing came open access journals, open access initiatives, institutional repositories, preprint servers, altmetrics, and new publishing business models. Are we tired yet? The internet enabled wide dissemination of scholarly research, but there was an expectation that it would cost less to publish journals, which should have meant that there would be relief for library collections budgets, except that didn't happen. So if we could start from scratch with the tools and technology we have today, this time I would want to create a publishing ecosystem, publishing models based on the needs of researchers, their institutions, and consumers, both scholars and the general public. I envision a roundtable discussion of sorts. At the table, there would be representatives from higher education, researchers, authors, and readers. When they sit at that table, they come without preconceived or ill-conceived notions, such as digital publishing, technology, innovation. These mean reduced costs. And no one at that table will think that publishers are greedy. Also, if the library is still the main payer, whether it's funding fees on behalf of authors or maintaining repositories or preprint servers or still paying for subscriptions, if the library pays, everybody at the table agrees to fund the library adequately. This new or reformed publishing ecosystem would still keep the activities required to publish. Content would still need to be curated. Peer or expert review will still be necessary. And there will be platforms with the bells and whistles our end users want. There must also be the recognition that these activities require resources, such as money, people, technology, infrastructure. Did I mention money? It's also critical, in my opinion, to move away from the notion that a scholar's or researcher's salary, promotion, and tenure are largely judged by the number of citations or downloads. Perhaps the quality and impact of their research and/or learning outcomes would serve as better measures. I envision a publishing ecosystem where a faculty member doesn't call to ask a librarian. My department chair just gave me a list of 10 public health journals. Tell me which is the best one to publish in. We, of course, should keep moving towards open everything because that is when the full potential of technology, the internet, can be realized. Fast, widespread dissemination of and access to scholarly research. Then again, if elements such as prestige, promotion, job security are removed from the scholarly publishing equation or their significance is reduced, open access might be the norm, the default, not something towards which we need to transition. All of the above may seem unrealistic. Established incentives in academia can't be changed now, or librarians can't change it, or whatever comes next has to come from where we are currently. Or maybe what I envision is too general. It's only partly by design. I want to hear your ideas. And 10 minutes isn't long enough to go through all the questions in the session description. But it's also because there's so much happening right now. We all want to get to open everything, but we're trying a lot of different things to get there. It may look completely different when we get to the other side, if we do. Or maybe things won't be all that different. These new open access agreements, they seem to change the pot of money from which libraries pay for articles. Instead of subscriptions, the library pays for, and I've lost my page, pays for the article processing charges. But there are already grumblings about the inflation rate of APCs. What happens down the road if the library budgets remain flat or continue to be cut? And in the US context, will we end up with 50 different transformative agreements, one for each state university system, multiplied by the number of publishers? Or will there be an agreement per consortium, multiplied by the number of publishers? I'm also not thrilled with mandates, especially if they involve punitive consequences. Suggesting where researchers publish is partly responsible for the current situation, in my opinion, while dictating where and how to publish gets us out of it. And preprint servers, they're growing at a fast rate. What I wonder, if an article is deposited and reviewed and published in the preprint server environment, infrastructure, and the institution pays for the APC, or it's so minimal that outside funding isn't needed, what is the library's role in that scenario? I don't have too many answers, more questions, but I'm looking forward to your comments and a discussion, lively or not. Thank you. Or you can hold them for later. Anything? Thank you.
Hi, everyone. I'm Sarah, at PLOS now since April. I'm going to answer the prompt in one sentence and then actually step back to the sort of thinking that foreground it, because I think in some ways that's more interesting than my answer. And if we get around unpacking my answer, we can talk about that. So if we were to start over, I would hope that we would valorize the dissemination of any rigorous attempt at understanding the world, whether that's dramaturgy or astrophysics. The dissemination of the process of discovery would valorize process and not products or artifacts or objects. So throw that out there, and then I'll come back to it. So there were two sort of strands of thought that came as I was thinking through this question, and Rita, you beautifully teed them up for me, so thank you. I was asking the group, are we positing a world where all of the infrastructure and stakeholders related to it are starting anew, and we're answering the question of how would we rebuild, or are we positing a world that's basically this one, but there's been some sort of very specific cataclysmic event that's led to us having to kind of answer this question. And you have two very different sets of answers, right, if you consider those scenarios. The former scenario is much more exciting. If it's a little utopian, you can start to really think big, right? The second scenario, more pragmatic, perhaps more useful, a little more boring. And so I was trying to think, well, what's the difference between these scenarios? I mean, we can talk about open peer review and recognition for data sets and other kinds of publishing outputs, but rather than pick one, the realization I came to, and this is not like earth-shattering or anything, it was just sort of clarifying and disappointing at the same time, was the fundamental difference between both of those scenarios, that the thing that would make the biggest difference is a change in incentive structures. That's really the biggest difference between scenario 1 and scenario 2. And that was just very disheartening. Because again, in a perfect world, if we moved away from the incentive structures that we have now, which are deeply built into kind of the superstructure of how publishing's worked for 300 years, then we could really think differently about this. But until a bunch of people retire or die, we're not going to get around to that at the speed with which some of us would like. So that was my first sort of set of considerations. The second was to just step back for a second and think what a privilege it is to ask the question, right? The ability to step back suggests that, for all the problems in the scholarly communications ecosystem, it's basically doing what it's supposed to do. It definitely has inherent sort of structural inequities, and those, I think, are starting to come to the fore in a way that's forcing us to address this in a bit more of an aggressive way. But it's a true luxury to be able to step back and say, let me think how we do this over, and that tends to be a function of already having something to think about. And I think we should remember, even as we engage in this thought experiment, there are communities globally today that are answering this question in real time because they don't have any other option. There's not an existing infrastructure that they can think about bringing down. So I think of research that's going on urgently in transitioning economies where, the work that I do here dramatically impacts, how we think about crop yields in sub-Saharan Africa, or how we think about waterborne illnesses in places impacted by climate change, right? The ability to take the work that I did and then get it to the people who need it to solve a problem. I mean, the Ebola vaccine research, I think, is a really good example of this. Like, I don't have the luxury of figuring out this, perfect ecosystem. We need to get the findings out to the people who need them quickly because, lives depend on it, right? I think Latin America has done a really interesting job in thinking through this problem, understanding that they were never going to be sort of resource rich the way the ecosystem we come from is. And so this idea of a shared open infrastructure where researchers could publish in their local language, where the focus was really going to be on outcomes that are regionally important. I think we lose sight anyway that there are people addressing this question on the ground because it's an imperative rather than a luxury of the thought experiment. How am I doing on time? Oh, I went too fast. Okay, so that's kind of what foregrounded my thinking around this. And so I guess I have a little bit of time to unpack. The scenario that I'm thinking through is closer to the sort of utopian than the insanely practical. But I do think in certain fields and in certain sort of microcosms, this could be implemented in theory. So kind of what I envision is sort of registered reports on steroids, right? So rather than have your methodology peer-reviewed, every aspect of the knowledge-finding process would be peer-reviewed. So from the minute a researcher poses a question to either would be sort of community vetted. I mean, there's all kinds of problems with this. We can talk about that in a second. The community, whatever, would peer review is the question worth asking. Spinning out from that, everything from the people who would come together to do the research, the sources of funding, the what needs to be pulled together to actually execute on the research, every step of that would be community vetted and agreed upon, ideally in alignment with a set of norms around actual problems that we need to solve. So it becomes the question of what happens to fundamental research, right? From there, all of this would exist in some magical digital space where everything is robustly, tagged and associated with each other. And every unfurling of the discovery process would be, I don't know what the word for that is, but they would all sort of, I envision like a tree, right, where everything is kind of linked together. And so, perhaps the answers from a survey an anthropologist is doing is posted here. So the next tree out of that would be Courtney asking a question related to that, and then her research question would then go through that entire iterative process that would then be clearly related because she's pulled that from something that's already in this kind of networked tree sort of environment. And so the difference, I think, in this ecosystem is the process of discovery is what you're prioritizing. It is not, I answered a question, I did some, I picked a question, I did some research, I have a paper, now evaluate my paper, right? It's not beginning, middle, end. It's understanding that all research is iterative and there's no sort of beginning and end. And to that end, it would be totally open and we'd all be able to see everything and we'd know how the money was spent and, well, obviously there's a ton of problems with this, but I can think of a couple scenarios that could do this. So places with no resource or incentive considerations, which are few and far between, but something that comes to mind, for example, is the Allen Brain Institute in Seattle. They have money falling out of the sky. Well, someone might contradict me on that, but last I checked, they did. They have a very kind of designated area of research they work in. And, obviously they need to demonstrate they're doing something to stay employed, but short of that, they're not sitting there thinking tenure, right? And so that's like a little microcosm where you could see the beginning to pilot this sort of, this kind of a process-driven approach to thinking about communication rather than a product-driven approach. And so, in summation, incentives seem to be the structure that kind of is really limiting us, and that's not new to anyone. We're extremely privileged to be able to ask the question, and we should always kind of pause and think, what are all the decisions that we're making right now in this kind of period of tumult? How do those decisions affect communities on the margins that are not going to be able to weigh in some of the ways that we are? And then, could we see a process-driven scholarly communications ecosphere? Someone said ecosphere yesterday. I was like, ooh, taking that. Those would be kind of my initial thoughts. Thank you for your time.
Sarah, yeah,
Hey.
It's Sharon from Reprints Desk.
Hello.
I just want, for my own understanding, while you were painting this picture, some words came to mind. It seems like you want to make a community-reviewed or crowd-reviewed mind map of the process of discovery.
That sounds good.
Because then usually when someone makes a mind map, they have like total consciousness when they're done because they can see the whole process.
Right, yeah.
So.
And I didn't come up, like, there's some sociologist or something who's like created a term for this sort of thing, but yes.
Yeah, I could see, just generally speaking, you would probably get more buy-in along the way, but you'd also get more friction and churn because people would be duking it out in each.
Well, this is the thing, and if you're incentivized to be competitive, to get there first, to only share what's novel and not what happened, none of this can work, right? There's got to be a presumption that we're sort of all in it together, and therefore sharing everything is valuable. And without that presumption, it's not possible, I don't think.
Yeah, and then I think blockchain would help the whole process.
Yes,
Yeah.
so very interesting. Blockchain, the piece it could play to make that both cost-effective and scalable, but at least from my understanding of blockchain, the climate impact of that alone is insane. That's my own thing telling me to stop. So that's always my issue, my challenge with blockchain, but I think that's a really good way of putting it. Thank you, I have a word now to think about it.
Thank you. Right. As a reminder, I'm Oliver Gadsby from Rowman and Littlefield, the largest North American publisher of scholarly content. So we're grappling with this all the time. But I'm first going to ask the question, well, who needs publishing these days? We are, as we come into this room, we're trailing data wherever we go. We're leaving our data footprint. We were thrilled, of course, that Google is going to develop a quantum computer that's millions of times faster than anything else. We're thrilled that our data is held securely by Facebook and Cambridge Analytica and used in all sorts of creative ways. And we can so easily find people that we agree with these days and attack those that we don't agree with. So there are all sorts of things going on which have nothing to do with publishing. But let me just pause there actually and also go back in time, because I'm a member of a institution in London that has done this all before. The Stationers' Company was founded in 1403 by the scribes who sat round, they're no longer there. They sat at their stations around St Paul's Cathedral, and they got together and formed a guild to protect their industry. And it developed into, in 1562, the Stationers' Company was put at the centre of what became copyright. There was an obligation to go to the stationers and write in the register your claim to a book, your right to copy. So Shakespeare's first folio is in the book, which we still have, Milton, Dryden, and so on. And in fact, the stationers developed this into a profitable business. They had unique rights to publish an almanac for a couple of centuries, which was very profitable. And as a complete aside, we still have the ledger as well, where the financial ledger saying investing £121 in An Adventure to Virginia. This is February 1609, and in my view, it caused a lot of trouble. Anyway, so that, you know, there has been all that creation. But let's fast forward to the present, and I think we've gone through enormous technological changes. I started my publishing career when cut and paste meant cut and paste, and there was the smell of glue around the design departments. But but it's moved on. But I think at the heart of all of this is not technology, but people. I start with the people who are writing and reading, and I've had some interesting conversations about this over the last few weeks with some of our authors, talking about that motivation to write. Still the publish or perish thing going on, although chasing after funding seems to be as much of a pressure as the publish or perish these days. But one author talked of the desire to expand on previous knowledge. Another said, well, I want to leave knowledge on the shelves for future generations to pick apart. So all of that going on, the motivation to read, an interesting reflection from one author was that actually with all of the tools that are available to people, sometimes they see their students developing their voice as writers first and doing blogs and doing all kinds of writing before they develop the habit of reading. I don't know if that echoes with you, but the habit of reading grows out of that rather than the other way around. And of course, the desire to advance and prosper and the joy of collaboration, I think, is central in a lot of the publishing process. If I come to the interaction between all of that reading and writing and the publishing industry as I know it, I think, again, it's about the people and the value that's added along the way by people in the process. I commend to you Kent Anderson's great piece on what is now 102 things journal publishers do, which has grown over I think it started with 85 or something, and then he's had to add more over the years. But it's a great list. But essentially that kind of shaping and testing and designing and producing and disseminating content is a wonderful creative process. And I think what I see at the heart of it is often the relationship between an author and an acquisitions editor, who is not merely a recipient of manuscripts. This is someone who shapes, sparks ideas, has coffee, creates thoughts about, well, you could combine this and that, and what about shaping that, and so on. And that good relationship, I think, should be at the heart of any publishing venture and ecosystem or ecosphere. And then there's all sorts of machinery around publishing that kind of works, but needs improvement, and I'll come on to the improvement. I think, libraries and publishers have gone through an amazing evolution over the last 25 years, embracing technology, finding ways of using it, finding all sorts of new worlds of metadata that helps content spread and find its readership. And they haven't lost their place in the ecosystem in the way that arguably the music publishers did and ceded it to others. So I'm taking a rather book-centric approach because I'm a book person principally. We did a focus group yesterday with, and some of you may have been there, with librarians, and they were talking about different platforms and so on. And the librarian said the great thing about the book is that they all operate the same way. And I thought that was a nice comment. So for the future, I would build on the present, and I would have 3 watchwords in that process. Choice is one. I think choice for authors, choice for readers, choice for libraries. I think there's a great movement in our world at the high, these mega corporations to kind of lock you into their world and force you to take everlasting subscriptions and not get out. And I think I prefer choice. And choice of format, of course, print, digital, and all the interaction around that. Affordability is clearly a key thing, and certainly we work hard on affordability for students, amongst others. And sustainability, it's got to keep on running. And we operate in a world where open access is much debated. Can it work in the humanities and social sciences? And we have an open access offer. Essentially, so far, the open access models are flipping the funding from the user paying to the creator or the institution paying, and I'm not utterly convinced that is the answer or doesn't cause more problems than it solves. But anyway, and certainly I would observe there's a big rift emerging between Europe, where open access is an absolutely dominant topic of conversation at any conference like this, and less so here, where choice, I think, is more appreciated and valued. Financial model needs to be sustainable as well. And for me, the paid-for model seems to be robust and tested over those centuries. I enjoy the fact that we send royalty checks to authors, and as their careers develop, that can be a growing feature. And by the way, it is possible to run a monograph business which sustains itself and generates profits for the next round of publishing. You would sometimes think that's not the case. So all of that, but it's got to be better in this new ecosystem. And if I've got 2 minutes, have I? Yes? Yep. I'll just quote, I was talking about this with Professor Tricia Jones at Temple, who she had an absolute list of, well, it needs to be more this and more that. And her words were more deliberative processes, linking from the book, taking it into the learning environment, lots of discussion around it, more longitudinal so that issues don't just get highlighted and then forgotten, that the debate is pursued, more targeted at authors and readers outside the academy, and more interdisciplinary, get everyone out of the silo. And I would echo much of that and try to think of creative ways of doing it. And I would add my final list, you'll have your own wish list of more what and more the differences you'd like. Languages, I come from a languages background and rather regret the way the world seems to be more and more English language, and it was great to hear about the examples from Latin America, because the voices of the global south, I think, risk being crowded out and not heard, and that's something we should work on. I think we all still need to work on discoverability. We've got some slightly archaic systems we keep improving, but there's this kind of ISBN base, which is a bit of a legacy system, and other things in journals. But to get from discovery to product in hand, print book or digital content or whatever, speed generally needs to improve, through the publishing process, through the dissemination process. And by the way, I would add, I've just thought of it, shipping stuff around the world is clearly a madness that sort of still goes on. There's still shiploads of books going places. And now that we have distributed digital printing, as we call it, we can print in Singapore and Australia and print near the customer as close to possible where print is relevant. Accessibility is something we need to get better at, and I think the industry needs to get better at, and is being challenged on both at the library level and the publisher level. And finally, I would just say, getting away from this was another quote from yesterday, there's just too much stuff. And I think publishers and the publishing ecosystem does play a great part in the filtering and highlighting and collating of stuff in a way that's useful to the academic community. Thank you.
as we play musical chairs. Good afternoon. Courtney Young, the University Librarian at Colgate University. A lot of my colleagues have already said a lot of the things that I was thinking about with regards to this topic. So I apologize that there'll be a little bit of duplication, but it also represents the fact that as we thought through this, we probably very much started in the same place and then started to branch out, as it were. I also picked the brains of a few of my colleagues on this topic to sort of help me get outside the box, as it were, in terms of my thinking. And I'll start with the piece that I thought was a really good sort of foundation and grounding piece, and that's that whatever this new model would be or would look like, that it'd be really important that it be something that really serves the public good, and sort of scholarly publishing as being a public good. You know, the research that's being generated at all types of institutions benefits the public good, not just sort of those federally grant-funded resources. And so, you know, we need, hopefully, if this was something that we all accepted as being an important thing, it could provide a real strong counter-argument on the value of higher education institutions. So if we're a public good, then it makes sense that we do need to fund our universities. There isn't a question of the value that they add to society as a whole. One of the things that's been mentioned that I think is also incredibly important in rethinking this process that actually might be a real kind of stumbling block for us is the tenure and promotion system. Let's just talk about the elephant in the room. You know, if there was a real value of the democratic notions like access or student and faculty impact over sort of journal prestige, then I think that that would really help to unlock and provide the scholars that many of us are supporting to do the good work that they do, to create that tree that was described and provide an opportunity to really have some of those dialogues. You know, so if the system stays rooted in this very sort of centuries past process, then the publishing landscape really may not be able to shift. And I think that that's going to be one of the most challenging things for us to sort of unlock so that we can sort of move forward. I think that there have been sort of small fits and starts in this area, but I think it really is a part of the process and is an acknowledgement of the fact that we need more people on board with us, believing in this rethinking as we move forward. Technology, of course, was one of the elements of the question, and I think it certainly does play a role as being sort of a lever in unlocking this, the ability to print, you know, to Singapore, to Australia, to wherever, as opposed to shipping things all around. But one of the things we need to be cognizant of is the fact that it can kind of perpetuate some of the systems that create some inequality in the publishing systems and platforms, and, you know, what do we do to make sure that it doesn't then prioritize some places over others because they can't afford the technology or use the technology, so that we can provide that service of the public good and distribute things in a very broad sense. You know, think about what some of these pieces might look like, and it may be that they're standalone short form works that are available as single items, and that or within user designed packages. And so they may say, I want these 3 book chapters, and I want a couple of articles, and I guess I want this whole book, and that's the piece and the thing that I want. How can we provide that to someone, as opposed to them going to maybe 2 or 3 or 4 resources in order to pull that together and really truly pull that content together, not sort of identify stuff that they need to request through Interlibrary alone and, oh, okay, that one's available online. If we've truly created something that is a la carte in a real way that delivers those products, then that, I think, could be a very useful thing for our users. Peer review processes were sort of been mentioned. I like the notion of starting it off as the idea being the place where it starts. But one of the things that wasn't maybe sort of explicitly said that think about is that it becomes an open peer review process, and it replaces blind review, so that it really does start to create that sort of sense of community that I think is going to be necessary sort of moving forward in this process, that makes this notion very exciting. You know, authors and institutions could retain rights. You could sort of figure out whether or not, if it's an institutional piece and someone moves from institution to institution, what does that look like? How do you pass that baton? Are they moving to an institution where it truly is possible? But if things are open access and we're doing the, you know, serving the public good, that may not be as big of a challenge, but it's something sort of for us to consider. One of my colleagues thought that sort of open science could be sort of the new normal. So you've open data, you've open software, you have open collaborative platforms. We know that this is something that is working sort of in an open science sense. How do we transform that to other disciplines and get their buy-in? We need to think about our role as consultants and mediators, our role being, you know, librarians and library staff, being sort of those consultants and mediators between researchers and the distributors of content. In some very practical sense that sort of came to me a couple of days ago, you know, classification is a really big part of what we do. And do our classification systems start anew if we're in this new environment? Are we still using LC or Dewey classification, or is this a real opportunity for us to transform the ways in which we classify things? I think it has to change. I think that this creates a real opportunity to influence access, and I think that equity, diversity, inclusion with the names that we're using, the controlled vocabulary, the classification as an opportunity to reflect a real inclusive, anti-racist, anti-sexist, anti-homophobic approach, so that our catalogs no longer reflect that we're talking about people who are natives to this country as being Indians of North America. We have a real chance to also influence and transform that component of the materials that we are providing access to. And we can provide that access, I think, in a really sort of forward-thinking way. You know, a lot of this thought is around sort of journals and then maybe chapters in books. And the book piece, I think, is a really challenging part of this process, because sort of these whole pieces and you know, what does it look like? And is it equitable in terms of how we change what we're thinking about? Is it really clear that, you know, with journals, we need to do these things, but we think of books as being these sort of whole pieces, and people who like to smell of books and to see them on the shelves, and sort of how does that really transform and unlock in sort of this new process? And I want to just admit that I really kind of struggle and unsure of how that needle gets pushed. And maybe it's with journal articles and with book chapters that we start, and then it'll sort of start to fall in place what it will look like for books. I think that it's also important, with the couple minutes that I have left, that we think of, you know, who these shifts and who they impact. And it's obviously the resources themselves, which I've talked a lot about. Some of it, of course, is going to be on those of us who do the work, librarians, library staff, scholars, societies and associations, consortia, and then some access to that content. But like, for example, I think that the consortia might have an interesting role to play in sort of creating and sustaining collections, because that's really influenced the way in which we're developing our collections and talking about how we have access. Fostering collaborations, because I think that in this new model, we really want to get away from the competitive, or I would like to get away from the competitive and move more into the collaborative. You know, and it could really change the landscape. And I also think that, you know, the opportunity to really set standards would also exist, whether it be related to quality or rigor or other things like that could be a part of that conversation. You know, and finally, new forms of scholarship could emerge. You know, as one of my colleagues kind of put it, you know, we could finally move beyond the PDF. you know, as being sort of the container for that scholarship. So it's not just something that's kind of fad-like as well, that we could truly, really say, these are all the things that make up what scholarship looks like, and we're going to be able to provide access to them, you know, no matter what that scholarship looks like. So those are my thoughts. Thank you.
So I'm going to kick off the general discussion with a question that occurred to me, and I'll just put this out to the whole panel. As you guys were doing your excellent presentations, a thought that kept coming back to me was the system that we have now was not created by librarians, and honestly, it wasn't even created by publishers. It was created by the scholars. In the current system, it's really the scholars that are the engine driving the continued vitality of the current system. If the authors wanted to get beyond the PDF, we'd have gotten beyond the PDF. If authors thought that we needed a better system than submitting articles to high prestige journals, they wouldn't be submitting articles to high prestige journals. They'd be doing something else. And of course, some of them are. But I guess my question is, let's imagine a scenario where we wake up tomorrow morning, the existing scholarly communication system has disappeared and it's time to create something new. What reason do we have to think that the scholars who are going to determine whether or not this new system actually works are going to want something radically different from what they have now? Not whether they should want something radically different from what they have now, but what do we have good reason to think that they would want something different? Yeah. And with that, the program ended. Thank you so much to all of you for coming.
So, couple pushbacks on that. The way you constructed that suggests that, like, I felt like we're blaming the victim, that authors like have a kind of agency that I think in principle they have, but I'm on an ongoing Twitter thing with Lisa Hinchcliffe about this. And like she in theory wants to publish anywhere she can, but she knows she has to publish in certain places for certain things to happen to her, right?
But who is it that requires that of her? It's not her institution. It's her colleagues.
Right.
Who are authors.
Right, but her colleagues are part of a sort of structure. The institution is part of that structure, right? And her colleagues are part of that structure. So I guess what I found myself thinking was like, it's more of a nurture thing and a nature thing. If you came up in this system,
right,
this is the system you know, and while you may want to get away from it, I think it's very hard to do. I was talking to an early career researcher kind of to prep for this, and she was like, I'm so wrapped up in this, I really struggle to think like how else it could be different. Right. So yeah, just pushing back on if authors wanted to change things, they would. I don't think that's
and I think you're right that it's not safe to assume that if they wanted to change it, it would be easy for them to do and they could just do it. I think we also need to be careful not to assume that they're being held hostage by the situation. I think we need to see evidence either way. Do they think this system is fine? Or do they hate the system and wish that they could change it, but for those structural reasons you described, there's too much inertia for them to overcome it? I don't know what kind of evidence we have in either direction yet.
So just a personal story about the nurture thing. Whoever, I think you said it, or maybe you said it. In that long list in the bio of all the places I've worked, it wasn't until I was 19 years into my working in libraries that I was in a university that had the tenure system for librarians. Now, I grew up in academia. When I was a kid, I didn't know what tenure was, but I remember still the relief on my dad's face at dinner that night when he said, I have tenure, and I'm like, oh, that's cool. So, even as a paraprofessional, I was doing poster sessions. I had a mentor who encouraged me to do this. But the first 2 years at the state university that required tenure, I freaked out. The first 6 months, I was so stressed until one day I realized, but I've always been doing scholarship. I've always been doing service. I've been doing a really good job, you know. So and then the cloud lifted. So I do think if you have come up in that system, I mean, the medical libraries I worked in did not have, we were adjunct faculty, we didn't have to, we had promotion tracks or not, but we didn't have to worry about, you know, you have to do this, this, and this, and you have to do it by this time, and you will be judged, you know, on it. So if there was, I think if there were more universities that kind of went that route, I know in our field, there are tenured positions for librarians, and there are not tenured. So I just think that for me, that made such a difference. And once that pressure was off, I just kept doing what I was doing, you know, and I didn't publish for the sake of publishing, because that's not what I had been doing. And another thing I remembered as soon as I graduated, one of my mentors, I was looking around where to apply for professional librarian jobs, and my mentor told me, do not go to that university because they just churn out paper after paper after paper in the first year, and then they don't give you tenure. So these kind of things were in the back of my mind for my career all the time, but I didn't check whether or not it was a tenured position at that one library. So I do think if we can, it's not going to be the librarian that does it. I kind of thought that when altmetrics came around, I mean, I was like a data collection assessment type person all along. So I thought there's going to be this new generation of scholars who are more going to want to feed off their, you know, the clicks and the everything else, but that didn't quite happen, right? Because the structures are still there. So.
Yeah, I was just going to comment that authors want to expose their ideas to people whose opinions they value and who might move the debate forward. And so one way or another, you need an aggregation and accumulation of both authorship and readership. And I guess with books and with journals, we've arrived at a system that works, that people understand. Imperfect though it may be, but I mean the alternative is perhaps a dispersal and a complete reliance on people finding things, and we haven't yet got a perfect system for that.
One of the things that we found in our libraries, we've tried to engage faculty and talk about open access is, you know, we'll say, well, don't you want your work to be as widely dispersed as possible so that it can have as much impact and be read as, and typically the answer is not really. I mean, I'm fine with anybody who wants to reading my work, but the reason I submit to this journal is because I know the people who I really want to see my work will see it if it's in that journal. It's not just I will be judged, you know, I'll be given credit for publishing in the high impact journal. It's also that this journal's readership is the people who I really care about seeing my work. And we kind of go, ooh, but we want you to want everybody to read your work. And it's not necessarily always what they want. Okay, other thoughts, comments? If one of you had the opportunity to rebuild the system from the ground up, what might it look like?
Hi, Adam Chesler from AIP Publishing.
Get right close in there. There you go.
I don't know it well enough. Adam Chesler from AIP Publishing, and I don't have an answer to that question. I came up before you asked it. But I was wondering if, in large part, without meaning to suggest that the system we have now, and let's say the system we have now is mostly subscription-oriented, for the sake of argument, is imperfect. And I'd be the first to say it's got its flaws. But if we were to say it's rather than reinventing this entire system, based on what you've talked about with authors, what other people up here have suggested, it really always seems to come down to the fact that if subscriptions just cost less, most people would probably say, we're good. And there are publishers who work with, whether it's Hanari or INASP or other, there are other vehicles out there that help provide low-cost access to the community at large. And I guess there's not a question in here really, as much as I sometimes wonder if we're spending an awful lot of bandwidth and intellectual capital on trying to reinvent this, when what we're really always coming back to is if, I don't want to pick a name of a publisher or the name of a journal, okay, because that's not what this statement's about. But if Journal X, which is really, really important, whether it's the macro sense or if it's just in a niche field, simply cost half of what it does, for example, then way more people would be able to subscribe to it. And with some of these other tools that are available for people who really, really can't afford it, suddenly everyone's got access to it. Are we still having these conversations? And if that's the answer, yeah, we would be fine, then why aren't we spending more time worrying about that and less time worrying about working on government or ministry levels on how we're going to completely blow up and redevelop the whole system?
So yeah, you've hit on a really fundamental question, which is in fact the system fundamentally broken, or is the system fundamentally sound but the prices are too high? Which is a really fraught question.
Yeah, so that's why I deliberately brought up the great cereals pricing crisis. I've been around a long time, and a lot of days I think everything we're talking about now is the reaction to library budget cuts. I mean, yes, there are pricing issues. As a paraprofessional, I had no say in anything except just gathering the data. But yeah, it made me angry when I saw what we were being charged here in the US versus what was happening, in other parts of the world, or even the differential between an individual subscription versus, but it, 20, 30 years later, it's about the budget cuts and not being able to maintain the subscriptions. So that's also why I kind of worry about shifting it to funding author fees, libraries funding author fees, because I don't know if that really solves much. It may reduce it temporarily, but they're not going to stay fixed, right? So anyways.
The one thought I had about that is, I think if you don't take into account the explosion in communities that are publishing a lot and want to keep publishing a lot, that sort of discussion makes a lot of sense. I think you can't separate that from the fact that at least publishers seem to feel like they need to accommodate this massive influx of stuff to vet, to reject, to accept.
So even if subscription prices on a per journal basis are reasonable, when you've got 2,000 more journals in a field today than you had 10 years ago,
Yeah,
you've got a cost
problem.
issue.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Kristen from Duke University Press, and I apologize, I'm going to pop us back to professionalization and the question of how that works in academy. So, as a practical person, I guess I'm really interested in hearing what you guys have seen from academics on your own institutions, if they're open to having conversations of alternate methods of scholarship. Yeah, because I think probably actually reaching out and seeing, okay, are there ways that the library can help support alternate tenure practices or support the infrastructure for, I saw in someone's tenure package a really great website that was interactive and was intended to be a teaching tool, and it got great results. And I'm sure there are other paths out there. So I'd love to hear those examples.
That's a great question. I think that we do have those conversations on a, discipline by discipline on a fairly regular basis. And I think that particularly when you have those conversations with a faculty member here and there, there's an interest, but, there are also the comments of, that this would of course not get any traction within my department or my program or my college. There's that interest on an individual level, but then it's the, well, we're going to blame tenure and promotion as being sort of the reason that I can do this. I've been told I could do this, but I should probably wait until I've gone through my tenure review, and then I can explore these other things. I think we try to have those conversations, but in institutions, some institutions don't have the appetite for it, aren't interested in the risk associated with it. And then also it would be, well, if we did this different thing, does that hold us back from keeping up with our peer institutions, the institutions who are aspirational to us? Yeah, and so until the aspirational institutions start doing that, there's going to be, there's not a lot of room for that kind of risk-taking in doing something different. I think there are people here and there who are willing to do it. I think it would be helpful if probably more senior faculty members were willing to do it so that they had an understanding of what it is that others want to do. But, it's like, this is different from what we did and you need to do this. I think that's the challenge. I'm surprised how slow that process has been and probably will continue to be.
And even within an institution, you can see that kind of variance from department to department or college to college. Just because chemistry is doing that, don't tell me that I have to do it.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes. There's a couple folks in line.
Yeah. Yeah, the gentleman in the purple shirt, I think, is first. Please.
It's the provocative question. Brad Warren, University of Cincinnati. So, Sarah, when you started your piece, you said something that really spoke to me, which is we're dealing with essentially a systemic issue. And you said, what would change it? Is it a catastrophe? And I was actually thinking, generally speaking, we have 300 years of iteration, or even going further back, I would love to see that ledger book if I ever go and visit you. And it has survived all sorts of catastrophic changes over a very long period of time. And so, in a sense, you think, well, maybe there isn't a catastrophe that would warrant a drastic change, but I'm curious if you say, dramatic drops in decreases in enrollment, the fact of scholarship and emerging fields in outside of North America and Western Europe, or climate change. And I'm not trying to be negative with it, but if you say, are there sort of future-proofing kind of catastrophes or things that would shake the system up enough, in your opinion, that would give us that opportunity to really rethink this, or should we just focus on more iterative change and just sort of poking at it? And that's the part that I'm curious as to what your thoughts are. Is there something we should be planning around to sort of future-proof ourselves while also dealing with this iterative change, which is just part of I would agree with Courtney, it's been a lot slower than what I thought it would be. So I'm curious as to your thoughts on that.
Oh, thanks. Two initial thoughts. I think the current political moment that we're in is something we need to pay serious attention to. I was just retweeting earlier this morning, a number of researchers are signing a petition accusing Vox of perpetuating the spread of misinformation around scholarly research, and it's sort of being co-opted by nationalist groups to sort of make cases that are, in bad faith and all of this sort of thing. And so all these researchers have signed a huge petition to really call this out. Kent Anderson's preprint argument, argument against preprints is we're just putting this kind of unvetted information out there that anyone can grab and do whatever they want with. And I don't know, I tend to think that 2 days ago was a really heartening moment for me in the sense that we do seem to be having a conversation that goes back and forth. But if we do keep on this trajectory where this very reactionary kind of worldview is happening kind of across the globe, I think of researchers in Brazil right now that are fighting with Bolsonaro's government to try to keep their campuses open, and the assumption that's being made at those campuses that if you're a researcher, you're a communist, and you're inherently here to undermine the government. Those are the sorts of trigger sort of events or possibilities that are always going to be, I think, a slow boil, not like a meteor hits, But the other part of your question about iterating, wasn't there another part? Right. Yeah, I think the challenge is the people who are moving to iteration tend to always be the same. And so just anyone on the margins of that is just trying to hang on. So interesting, I'm also having a Twitter debate about, I was in a session yesterday where I was sort of tweeting a little disconcertion that influencers in the scholarly community, you might have seen this, Rick, influencers in the scholarly communication kind of shrugging and going, well, you know, it's pretty hard to change this stuff. And I said that was a little bit disheartening. And they were like, well, Scholarly Kitchen and others came back and were like, well, you know, what are you proposing? And I was like, well, you know, what if a group of, you know, highly prestigious, respected society journals just said, as of 2025, we are no longer doing impact factors. We are phasing them out. We're going to work as a community to develop some other kinds of holistic metrics. We're going to do this with Clarivate. And we just, as a group, have decided we are not doing this anymore. And it's AAAS, and it's, you know, it's all the big folks. And the lists of like, but, no, how, no, like, you know, and sort of the kind of, sorry, but I have to okay boomer on some of those things. What, you know, people going like, it'll all fail, it's impossible to, and I was like, but will it? Will it? I don't, so this is the iterative change is and of course the question was, well, shouldn't academics do that, right? That shouldn't come from publishers. And I was like, but somebody has to go first. So just go first.
Of course, it may not be a should question. It may just be a, you know, can it work if publishers do it rather than academics?
Yes, right.
Rather than academics doing it. And of course, you know, the okay millennial answer to that is, it's so easy to talk about bold ideas and say, we should do this, and then to react when somebody says, but here are some really concrete reasons why that would be problematic.
Yeah.
And this is part of the struggle that we're having in the larger and the larger conversation in our country right now, right? Is bold ideas being met with practical objections, and then how do you resolve that and move forward?
Yeah.
But if I may just pick up on Sarah's first point about the political age we live in, I was reading this morning the Freedom House report, which ranks the state of freedom in the world, and it ain't getting better, let's just say that. And you think of Turkey with academics and journalists locked up in their thousands, as just one example. So I think, you know, what we do is important, and yes, we're mainly in an iterative mode, but I think it matters, and we should hang on to what works, but keep building on it.
Yeah, good.
Oh, Rick, can I just
Oh, yeah, please,
throw out a
sorry.
question?
Yeah.
So I'm going to assume that there are many librarians in the room. Yes, no? Yeah? What do you think your role is in all of this? I mean, we've talked about either publishers, you know, taking this drastic step, or scholars. One of the things that was disheartening to me is, you know, that example I gave that, you know, here I am trying to promote open access on campus. That's my role. So I'm going to give you where you can look at open access journals, and then no, but I have this list. I can only publish in this list. And I'm like, is it my role?
And in some disciplines, it is that rigid. It's like there are three.
I really didn't think public health was one of them, but what do I know? I just have a degree in it. I obviously didn't care. But that moment, and I had a few of these just in the last 6 or 7 years, it was, maybe it's not my role as a librarian to change behavior. You know, maybe that's not, I should be like making sure I'm a good steward of our funds, et cetera, et cetera. So
there's actually three people in line ahead of you, and we are also now out of time.
Sorry, we talked.
I am so sorry, but I would like to invite everybody who did not get to ask their question. I don't know what our whole panel schedule is, but if you want to come down and talk to our panelists individually, I'm sure they'll be happy to do that to the degree that their schedules allow them to. And if not, you can get their business card and shoot them an email.
Or tweet
Or
questions.
tweet, even better. Okay, thank you so much to all of you for coming. Thanks to our panelists for their excellent presentations.